Welcome to Strange But True. Take a breath, slow down, and listen carefully. Some stories are documented, some are debated, some refuse to be explained. We tell you the stories. You decide what's true. Now, let's begin our journey. Most people follow rules every day without ever thinking about where they came from. They stop at certain places. They stand in certain lines. They fill out certain forms. They wait for certain permissions. They show documents when asked. They accept procedures they did not design. They obey requirements they never voted on, not because they are told to, not because they read a law, not because someone explains the reason. They follow the rule because it feels normal. And the more a rule feels normal, the harder it becomes to question. In earlier societies, most rules were local. They were negotiated. They were flexible. They were enforced by people who knew each other. Custom mattered more than paperwork. Memory mattered more than documentation. A rule could change if circumstances changed. A rule could bend if it caused harm. A rule could be ignored if it no longer made sense. There was no permanent record of most rules. They existed only as long as people agreed to follow them. If a rule stopped working, it was replaced. If a rule caused friction, it was softened. If a rule made no sense, it was quietly abandoned. Disputes were settled through conversation. Mistakes were corrected through negotiation. Exceptions were handled through judgment. That changed as societies grew larger, as cities expanded, as trade networks widened, as populations became harder to manage. Informal customs stopped working. Institutions began to formalize behavior. Rules were written down. They were printed. They were archived. They were standardized, not to control people, not to punish people, but to create predictability. A written rule could be enforced the same way every time. A written rule could be applied to people who had never met each other. A written rule could outlive the person who created it. Over time, written rules began replacing human judgment. A rule that once required discretion became a requirement that allowed none. A process that once involved discussion became a procedure that allowed no deviation. One of the clearest examples appears in the history of passports. For most of human history, people moved freely across borders. There were no permanent identity documents, no universal travel permissions, no standardized proof of nationality. Travelers carried letters of introduction. Merchants carried seals. Pilgrims carried religious credentials. Some travelers carried nothing at all. They relied on reputation. They relied on hospitality. They relied on social networks. But there was no global system that required everyone to prove who they were before they could move from one place to another. Borders existed. Kingdoms existed. Empires existed. But the idea that every person must carry an official identity document just to cross from one place to another did not. Movement was treated as a social act, not a bureaucratic transaction. That changed in 1914. As World War I began, European governments introduced temporary passport requirements, not to build a permanent system, not to reshape global travel, but to control wartime movement. The policy was described as temporary. It was framed as a security measure. It was framed as an emergency rule. It was framed as a short-term necessity. It was introduced without public referendums. It was introduced without international consensus. It was introduced without long-term planning. After the war ended, the passport system was supposed to disappear. It did not. Governments extended it. Border agencies kept enforcing it. New administrative offices were built around it. The temporary paperwork became permanent infrastructure. In 1920, the League of Nations held a conference on passports. They standardized passport formats. They standardized visa rules. They standardized border documentation. They created uniform templates. They defined physical dimensions. They established identity photo requirements. They published technical recommendations. They issued procedural guidelines. They circulated model designs. What began as an emergency measure quietly became a permanent rule. No global vote approved it. No single treaty forced it. It simply stayed. What makes this strange is not that passports exist. It's that no clear public moment marks when free movement officially ended. There is no single law that says, from this day forward, all humans must carry identity papers to cross borders. There is no universal declaration. There's no founding statute. There's no ceremonial beginning. The rule appeared gradually. Each government extended it. Each country copied it. Each border enforced it. Each new regulation referenced the last one. Each new form assumed the previous one already existed. Each new checkpoint treated the rule as already settled. By the time people noticed it was permanent, it already was. The original emergency context faded. What remained was the rule itself. A system built for a temporary crisis had become a permanent global standard. The paperwork outlived the war. The policy outlived its justification. The requirement outlived its explanation. Passports became embedded into everyday life. They became tied to employment. They became tied to banking. They became tied to education. They became tied to healthcare. They became tied to international mobility. What began as a travel document slowly became a general identity credential. The document did not just control movement. It began defining legal existence. This pattern appears again and again in modern systems. A rule is created for a narrow purpose. A rule is described as temporary. A rule is justified by convenience. Then the rule stays. Forms replace conversations. Requirements replace discretion. Procedures replace common sense. A process that once required judgment becomes a checklist that allows none. An exception that once seemed reasonable becomes a violation that must be corrected. And eventually, no one remembers a time before the rule existed. A second example appears in the history of building codes. For much of history, homes were built according to local knowledge. Builders relied on tradition. Materials were chosen based on availability. Designs were shaped by climate and culture. There were no universal standards. Construction decisions were negotiated on site. Adjustments were made in real time. Exceptions were common. A builder could adapt to terrain. A builder could adjust to weather. A builder could modify plans as needed. That changed in the 19th and early 20th centuries. As cities grew denser, fires spread faster. Buildings collapsed more often. Insurance companies began demanding safety rules. Municipal governments introduced building codes. At first, they were limited. They were practical. They addressed specific hazards. They regulated chimney heights. They required fire breaks. They limited overcrowding. They standardized materials. They defined load limits. They fixed minimum room sizes. They created permit systems. They established inspection offices. They formalized approval processes. But over time, they expanded. New requirements were added. Old exceptions were removed. Uniform standards replaced local judgment. Rules that once guided builders began controlling them. Construction shifted from craft to compliance. The code became more important than the context. Today, building codes are rarely questioned. Most people do not know who wrote them. Most people do not know when they changed. Most people do not know why certain rules exist. They are treated as natural features of reality. They are taught as necessities. They are enforced as absolutes. They are defended as permanent. The strange part is not that rules exist. The strange part is how rarely their origins are remembered. Rules do not always arrive through dramatic laws. They often arrive through quiet repetition. They persist because they work well enough. They persist because no one challenges them. They persist because changing them feels risky. They persist because undoing them feels more dangerous than keeping them. And over time, a temporary decision becomes a permanent reality. When people say, "That's just how things work," they're usually describing a system that once had a beginning, a rule that once had a purpose, a procedure that once had a justification, but that origin has been buried under routine. The rule no longer needs a reason, it only needs obedience. History has a way of hiding the truth inside what it chooses not to explain. Inside tales, inside myths, inside legends, inside things that feel just a little off. If this story held your attention, subscribe to Strange But True, because sometimes what sounds unbelievable is exactly where the truth hides.